Okay, folks, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi to folks on Zoom. Do we have a head count there, or are you moderating, or are we going to?
Yes, I am moderating.
Okay, excellent.
And Rose will be too.
So. Okay, cool. So I will do my best to get to all questions in a timely fashion. I know when I offered the corresponding course in the winter, we did have a lot of really good discussion. So I'll try to make sure everyone can participate, even if you're virtual today. So a couple of the obligatory Penn State slides. The feedback that I got when I taught this in the winter was that a lot of the folks, I wasn't sure if this was going to be a homeowners who had never had an apple tree before planting one in the backyard, or folks that were a little bit more seasoned. So I see a few familiar faces from last time. So what I did is I kind of went the opposite of what I did last time. This is one of my commercial grower presentations. And then I just added in a few slides that are more relevant to smaller scale production. So if I'm talking too high level, or if it's something that you want clarification on, please don't hesitate to stop me, to ask for more information, and I'm happy to provide it. I just want to make sure we cover all of our bases. This is me. Most of you have seen me around before. I have a background in integrated pest management, so that's kind of my bread and butter, and what I tend to base a lot of my management decisions around is the IPM framework. So I'm going to do a little bit of an overview of what that is, because I feel like it really helps to have that vocabulary when you're talking about things in fruit production. Even if you're just doing it on a small scale, having the right vocabulary really empowers you to make better management decisions, to find the tools and resources that are going to be most valuable to you, and to talk with folks about your needs as a grower.
Yes. People on Zoom cannot see the presentation moving along.
It's not progressing?
It's not progressing on there. Rude. Let me.
Wouldn't be a workshop without some tech issues, and doing the hybrid is always a fun endeavor.
Let's see if we can get this.
Give it a try. How's that?
Hey, Josie.
Yeah.
I can share my screen and I'll just follow along with what Megan is showing, okay?
Okay.
Are we good, Rose?
It's not. I'm just gonna switch it and I'll share and I'll follow where you are.
Okay, sounds good.
You can
I'll leave leave a little room for a delay. So this is a slide that I used in my winter session. In general, these are the fruits that are going to be the best choices. Depending on what your zone is and what your particular growing conditions are, you're going to have a lot more success with these than some other options. So in general, the tree fruit that we do really well with here are apples and pears, as evidenced by a lot of the feral and wild ones that we see out in these areas. Some people do have success with stone fruit. That really comes down to microclimate and your particular soil type. So that's a little bit less consistent of results that folks get in this area. The closer you are to the lake, the better you tend to be. There's that moderating effect of the large body of water. So you do see a lot more cherries, peaches, things like that down by the lake and along the escarpment. Not to say you can't have some success. They just you might have to do a little more research in what you're growing. Brambles do really well here. Strawberries, please don't ask me questions about strawberries. I'm really good with fruit. I can do tree nuts. Grapes are my thing. Strawberries are their whole own world, and I can put you in the direction of good resources, but they're not my favorite. I just like eating them. And we also get a lot of other berries. So blueberries do particularly well in our acidic soils that we tend to have in this area. And then there's a few specialties: currants, elderberries, gooseberries, and then of course grapes. I'm not going to talk too much about grapes today. I talk about grapes all the time, and you're welcome to come to any of my presentations. So my goal here is to talk about management throughout the spring and summer months. There's a lot that happens. Western New York has a very short growing season, so it goes kind of from 0 to 60 in a very short amount of time. So I wanted to review some of the framework and methods for finding the information that you need and learning, as well as some general maintenance tips that'll really help you be successful. The main goal is to not get overwhelmed and to understand that there are resources available at each step so that you don't get overwhelmed with the growing process when you're in the midst of it. So I mentioned IPM, Integrated Pest Management. Really what this comes down to is healthy plants are more resistant to any sort of issues that you may encounter. So how do you get a healthy plant? You do things like you make sure that the soil is prepared well, that they have the nutrition that they need, that there's airflow, that they're pruned correctly, and that you're watching for disease and pest damage. The next part is really making sure that you know how to identify. That doesn't mean that you have to memorize every single possible pest. It just means that you can look at damage, understand what is likely to cause that type of damage, and troubleshoot from that information. It's a spectrum, so not everything that I talk about is going to be relevant to your situation, but the tools work for everybody, even if they're applied differently. So this is about as technical as I'm going to get. I have one more slide that's kind of high level as far as it goes, but really this is how you want to build your platform for growing really anything. So you're going to start out with your cultural practices. That's your base of everything that you do. Your cultural practices include things like your site selection, your soil fertility, if you're going to rotate crops, if you're doing something that isn't a perennial, and your sanitation. So that means how well you are managing the tree itself in this case. Physical and mechanical, this is some of the tasks that we do that prevent pests from getting out of control. That's going to be things like mowing between your trees, removing dead or diseased material, and then putting on trunk protection during some of the months where they're more prone to things like deer damage or borers. Biological this is really maintaining a healthy environment around your trees. So making sure that you have a healthy environment for your pollinators, making sure that you're encouraging a healthy ecosystem that isn't just a monoculture. And then finally, you have your chemical strategies. That's your big guns when you have something going wrong. So that's your management and maintenance when these aren't cutting it and you do have an invasion of either a pest or a pathogen. So you want to start in that case too with the gentler materials. So things like safer soaps, dormant oils, things that don't have long-term health risks for yourself or the environment. And then you move on to the more serious things. So that's kind of the last ditch in an IPM program, is bringing out these stronger chemistries. And really you're trying to build a whole picture of healthy management throughout the life of your trees, your farm, your garden, whatever it is that you're attempting to grow. This is a slide that I leave in there for my commercial growers because a lot of the times I get through that first part and they go, oh, I don't know why you need to tell me all this stuff. I already do all these things. And there is an important component, like I mentioned before, in really understanding the language that people are using. Just because you're a hobbyist grower doesn't mean that you can't use the language of the commercial folks. You're doing the same thing. What are you trying to do? You're trying to grow some apples in a way that the apple tree is healthy, the environment is healthy, and you get delicious fruit. Same thing the commercial folks are doing, and there's a wealth of information on that side of things, which is why I'm here talking to you folks today. So really, IPM is something that goes across all types of disciplines, whether you're large scale, whether you're a home hobbyist. And there's a lot of reasons to adopt this language, to understand what people are talking about. And I think it really helps us as consumers as well to understand some of the methods that farmers are using so that we can make informed choices in our purchases as well. So, any questions so far? That's just kind of like the bigger overview, the why I'm presenting the way that I am today. Now we're going to kind of get into some of the bare bones of it. So when you start out with an IPM program, that base, those cultural practices, your prevention and management, these are the things that you really want to think about as you go into your growing season. If you're planting new plants, you want to really think about that site selection. We talked about that in the winter class. You really want to look as things start growing, if there's any new information that you can collect if you haven't planted your trees yet. So in the early spring, you can see where there might be erosion or runoff, where you might have freezes late into the spring, areas that are colder, more moist. That changes depending on the season. So you really want to have that information tucked away when you're deciding what you want to plant somewhere. If you plant a fruit tree with wet feet, you're always going to have issues with it. If it's on a very dry rise in the land, you might have to be supplying water for a very long time as that tree establishes. So you want that kind of information early on. Your sanitation practices, if you have an existing planting, are something that's going to be a really big deal coming into the following season. Sanitation practices are the removal of any disease or pest damage completely from your growing zone. So if you had a patch of fruit trees, if you had, say, fire blight that you pruned out, if you had black knot, if you had plums or something, you want to be able to remove that material, and if you can, burn it off site. Not right in the middle of your orchard if you can help it. Every piece of material that's still in that tree, mummy fruit is one of the big sources of disease, especially fungal disease. Every time that you leave something like that, you're creating a harbor for that disease to reinfect in the following spring when they get activated by warmer temperatures and more moisture in the air. You really want to think about some of your timing as well. So when it comes to things like putting on sprays, a lot of folks put on some early season sprays or some late dormant sprays. If you have insects waking up in the area, you want to make sure that you're preserving them as much as you can, which can mean spraying late in the evening or at night after most of the pollinator activity has decreased for the night. And you want to reduce your infection periods as well. So a term that is really helpful to get comfortable with when you're talking about fruit tree management, especially if you're going to look at any sort of guidebooks or additional resources, is phenology. I took the Britannica definition here. Phenology is the study of phenomena. So what is the phenomena we're talking about here? We're talking about the growth cycle of a tree. And oftentimes we can find information on the phenology of the tree that's matched with the phenology of insects or disease. So understanding how different management strategies fit into the year and which growing stages are the most crucial can be really helpful in building your management program throughout a season. I don't know how well you can see, but for example, apples, they have a set of events that happen in order every year. And each of those have corresponding actions and risks that occur. So silvertip, if you can see, that's your earliest growing stage. That's when the buds are starting to get fuzzy and swell just a little bit. You have green tip when the leaves are just starting to form and become visible. You have half-inch green, which is obviously a half-inch of green material. You have a tight cluster when the leaves are just getting ready to expand. You have first pink, that's when you're starting to see that preliminary blush in your apple blossoms. Full pink, first bloom, full bloom, and post bloom. Now, in most cropping systems, bloom is the most, actually probably all cropping systems, bloom is going to be one of the most important and noticeable time periods is really crucial to your management plan. During bloom, the vascular tissue of the plant is essentially exposed directly to the air, which means directly to pathogens that could invade that flower blossom while it's open. So there's a lot that you want to do to protect the tree during bloom. If you're not protected during bloom, you've essentially damaged your crop for the rest of the season. So there's a lot of actions and tasks that you want to do before you hit that bloom point. Pruning is one of them. Your fertilizer is usually going to go on right around bloom time. You're also, if you're going to apply any spray at all, even if you're on the fence about it, a coverage over your bloom period is going to be the most important one you could put on. If you don't put on any other sprays during the year, having something over bloom is going to be the most impactful for the cycle of your crop. When we're talking about phenology, there's some really fantastic free tools that are available. NUA is a free phenology-based weather modeling system. So NUA is hosted by Cornell, and it's a partnership with Penn State, and there are several other contributing land-grant universities around the country. If you hop onto this website, you can create a free account and find a weather station closest to you. Now, in this area, there are quite a few weather stations that are accessible, and what that can help you find is what the temperatures are looking like with some forecasting. So at the very, very simplest, this can tell you if there are drought conditions, if there are freeze risks on the horizon, and if you want to get a little bit more into it, there's disease and pest management models as well. So if you get in here and you go to the IPM tools, you can find for apples, for instance, there's a whole list of different diseases and pests or pathogens, and you can click on them and it will tell you how many degree days have accumulated. A degree day is a term that we use to describe the amount of heat required for some organisms to get to their different life stages, their phenology, right? Phenology is largely driven by the accumulation of warmth, especially with insects and fungus. So what happens is, as degree days accumulate, the pests move along through their life cycle, and most pests have one or two parts of their life cycle that are the most detrimental, right? Like if you think about a moth doesn't really do much, but a caterpillar causes a ton of damage, so you're really worried about the caterpillar. So knowing when they hit these different life stages can be helpful if you do need to manage for them if you see a lot of issues. Same with pathogen modeling. They will have infection periods. So if we're coming into a warm, wet period for some diseases, the NUA model can tell you, okay, Saturday, it looks like we're going to have an infection period. So if you're concerned about fire blight or something like that, or black rot, you could put on a spray in advance of that using the information there. Again, it's totally free. If you ever have questions about wanting to utilize this tool, I could probably do a future workshop just around that. Back to the pests. How do we know what to treat? Well, our identification is going to become really, really important. A pest is essentially any organism which is causing damage to something that we want to keep. Kind of like a weed is just a plant that's growing where you don't want it to be. Anything can be a pest if it's causing damage. You really want to get familiar with a few different things when you're trying to identify a pest. One of the things to keep in mind is, in most cases, you're not going to see the actual pest. You're going to see the damage caused by the pest. And the type of damage that you're seeing can help you figure out what type of pest you're dealing with and make some determinations as far as what you should do in terms of management. So you want to look for things like any debris or soot or crumbs that are left on leaves. You want to look to see if there's scrape marks, if there's yellowing, if you can see the veins of the leaf or any burns on the margins. You really want to be able to kind of quantify what you're looking at. A lot of times chewing insects, you can actually see like the bite marks on the leaves. You can find the insect frass. If you have something like spider mites or plant hoppers, you'll have stippling, which is little tiny dots on the leaves. So being able to find a leaf that has representative damage is really helpful. And you can provide that information to your local extension person, which in this case is probably me because there aren't too many tree food people on the Penn State side or on the Cornell side in this area. But having those pictures, snap a picture with your phone, grab your camera and get a picture, because a lot of folks are really good at diagnosing that stuff just from a few little simple things. So taking a picture, you could go to one of the garden supply spots. A lot of the nurseries are really knowledgeable when it comes to common pests and pathogens. So just being comfortable with your identification is a big one. And again, there's lots of really great resources available, lots of publications through Cornell. And again, you know, understanding what those life cycles look like in the grander scheme of things. We'll talk about lanternfly a little bit later. I'm kind of tired of talking about those guys. So a little bit more monitoring your populations. Really, when it comes to trees, you want to be looking at them all the time. So this time of year, you're starting to get some pests, some pathogens starting to wake up, especially with these warm days that we've had. So now's the time to start getting comfortable with your scouting. And what your scouting is just going and looking around. If you have 2 or 3 trees, maybe pulling down a branch and just looking at where they're at. What's going on? Do you see any insects? Do you see any damage? Do you see any dead or diseased areas that you might have missed if you did any pruning? And just really getting an idea of where you're at as you go into the growing season. That is a practice that you want to continue at least on a weekly basis throughout the growing season. That'll get you really comfortable with the phenology, get you comfortable with some of the changes, and notice if a change occurs. A lot of insects and pathogens, like I was mentioning, are only really damaging for a short amount of time. So knowing when that's occurring can also help narrow down some of the issues. So really, when it comes to getting yourself set up for the season, making sure that you have those notes, you have those scouting techniques, that you're making notation of some of the dates can be really helpful in subsequent years in making sure you're making the best decisions for what you need to do. Because again, when's the best time to treat for an issue? Before it's really an issue. Yeah.
Last year, we had a terrible problem with Japanese beetles. They wreaked havoc on, we have a blackberry bush, a couple of grapevines, and raspberry bushes.
Mm-hmm.
What can you do about this?
The question is, what can you do about Japanese beetles? And the person in the audience said that they were having issues in their raspberries, their grapes, and blackberries. They really like things in the rose family, which unfortunately a lot of things are in the rose family that we really like to grow around our homes. So one of the methods for reducing some of their habitat or reducing some of their numbers is if you have multifloral rows along any of your wood lines or nearby areas, that can draw in populations, and they overwinter as grubs in the soil. So if you have some of that invasive rose species, getting rid of some of that gets rid of some of their favorite things, so you won't be bringing in as many.
We've only been there like 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
But the neighbor, his cow pasture fence had that right there where our stuff is,
Mm-hmm.
but I kind of cut it down.
Mm-hmm.
Multiple rows.
It'll be back.
Well, yeah. I have to hack at it every year.
Yeah. So the question is just around the management. Now, if you have areas that you know are really getting inundated, there are some soil drenches you can use. There's a BT type product that targets more of the Japanese beetle. So it's like a bacteria that targets the larva in the soil. There's also a couple of pesticides you can use. I'm not entirely sure what all is approved for homeowner use, but I know there are a couple products that work pretty well. The one that's bacteria based works pretty good.
First thing I was on the set up some traps. The right trap?
There's a caveat with the traps.
So that's what I learned there. So I got rid of the traps. Last year I started spraying with 7. And 7 works. The other thing that you need to do is, especially if your trees are full of them, is I took neem oil and sprayed around. Your tree covers a certain circumference, and the ground all around it, because the beetles drop the ground, stays in the ground. The neem oil kills the larvae.
They also like my Japanese chestnut trees.
Yeah, they can be a big problem, and they not only are they defoliating when they're adults, but they eat the roots when they're larvae too, which is something you don't see but can be problematic for the plant. So one of the folks in the audience said neem oil they've had some success with, as well as 7. 7 is a broad spectrum insecticide. So if you're using something like 7, which you can purchase as a homeowner, my recommendation would be, again, to go with an evening time spray, and also be very mindful of wearing some protective material. Make sure you're wearing a mask, chemical resistant gloves, long pants and boots. And I mean, if you were one of my commercial growers, I'd have even more restrictions, but as a homeowner, you want those at a minimum. Goggles or glasses are good if you're mixing anything up. Make sure it's not very windy and it's not very hot when you're applying those materials. And you really want to mind, there's something called a PHI, which should be on the label, which is a pre-harvest interval. On homeowner products, it may have a slightly different wording, but not very much. And what that is a minimum amount of time that has to pass before you consume something that product has been applied to. So you really want to be mindful of that, because sometimes Japanese beetle can linger pretty late into the season. So you just want to be careful with that. Neem doesn't so much have that issue. You can wash it off, but it does smell pretty weird. So if you are going to put it on something, you probably don't want to do it right before you harvest. But
I just put it on the ground.
you put it on the ground as a soil drench. Excellent. So, so the grower said the neem oil worked well just on the ground to kill the larva. So, and again, neem oil, while it's relatively safe, especially for humans, it is broad spectrum when it comes to insects as well. So just, being mindful that you're not treating, tons and tons of land with that sort of material. So as far as this goes, just when you're talking about scouting, keeping notes, knowing when these things tend to appear. So with the Japanese beetles, with the traps, and this is something I've chatted with some of my colleagues in ornamentals as well. The thing people don't realize with the traps is that they create a plume. So where's the best place to put the trap? Probably across the street in your neighbor's house, because they're going to follow that plume to the concentrated point. And what I've found in my own gardens, because they really like to eat my husband's prize-winning dahlias, is that if the plume is angled to where there's something else they like to eat in its path, that they will still aggregate in the path of that plume. And that is, of course, problematic, because once they start aggregating, they have some sort of chemical communication. I don't know exactly what that is off the top of my head, but you'll find that if they have one plant they're chewing on, more will come. And if you can protect a couple of plants, they'll stick with the one that they all started chewing on at the beginning of season, especially that one if that plume overlapped from one of the traps. The traps do work. You just got to put them farther away than you think, and make sure whatever your prevailing wind direction is, isn't angling that plume at something else you don't want it to eat. So, but yeah, again, knowing when they come out. So maybe, and Japanese beetles are largely temperature dependent. I don't think we have a good model for them, but if you see them at a certain time of year, they're going to be pretty consistently around. So if every year by the second week of July, they're everywhere. If you're using a trap or something like that, or if you want to put a protectant on so you don't get that immediate aggregation, you want to do that a week or so before you normally see the first ones. And the only way you're going to know that is if you've been keeping notes over a couple of growing seasons. So I really can't stress that part enough. Knowing when things happen, understanding that phenology is really, really the structure that you need for good management. Another part that I just want to throw out there early on, as far as those notes go, by the end of season, you've got your apples, you've made some apple pie, some hard cider, whatever wonderful things you're going to make out of those apples when they finally are done off the tree. A lot of folks will put away their notes for the year. And really what can be extraordinarily helpful at the end of your season is to keep track of some of this stuff. How was your yield? Were the apples bigger or smaller? Were the pears more marked than normal? Were things sweeter? Did you get just blasted with Japanese beetles this year? Did you have Parasilla for the first time? And what materials, what chemistries did you use? And how successful they were? Obviously, if you're on the commercial side, you're required by law to keep track of some of those things. If you're using homeowner chemistries, not so much, but that doesn't mean that insects still can't develop resistance. or have better, or you might not, or you might have better success with one thing than another. So keeping notes of how well things worked can be really helpful as well. So going back to those methods for making sure that we have the best plant, the right plant in the right place is really where this starts. So choosing cultivars, if you know you have issues with fire blight in your area, if you know you've had issues with bitter rot, if you know your neighbor has issues with a certain disease or pathogen, if you're putting in new trees, it's probably worth it to look into cultivars that are resistant. There's been tons of amazing things done with plant breeding, and there's a lot of great nurseries around that will help you find and locate some of these cultivars. The type of rootstock that a desired cultivar is on can make a huge difference in terms of what type of conditions they can manage, and what type of resistance they may have to issues in the environment, be it weather or soil type or something like pest pressure. Something else to keep in mind, and it was something we chatted about briefly as we were getting started, as you're choosing plants, there have been some updates to the USDA hardiness zones because of warmer trending temperatures. And while I do agree that in most cases we are seeing warmer weather, which probably represents a change in the average for our zones, keep in mind that where we live in Western New York, we still get some pretty crazy late season weather events. So if possible, always err on the side of more hardy. I wouldn't recommend, even though most of us are in 6A now, as far as hardiness zone goes, if you can find something that's a 3 or a 4, you're going to stand a better chance of surviving something like that May 18th freeze that we got last year. So having something that handles those extremes is going to be a benefit going forward with some of these weather events that we see. Your site preparation. So this comes down to really looking at the environment that you have. So again, you really want to make sure stuff is well drained as much as possible. If you're on a very dry area, you want to make sure you have access to water, irrigation of some sort. The biggest thing that makes a difference in terms of nutrient management is going to be your pH. The best time, in my opinion, if you're only going to do periodic soil testing, if you want to make nutrient decisions for the following year, is going to be at the end of the growing season. So the end of the growing season, the crop's off, the plant's uptaken everything that it's going to for the year. Take your soil tests, and then that'll have you ready to go into the following year. Most of the time in our area, our pH is going to be low. I know a lot of the land between here and the lake can sit at like 4.5. For anyone that's not familiar with terms like pH, the neutral soil pH or neutral pH of anything, water, is 7. If you're lower than that, you're acidic. If you're higher than that, you're basic. We don't have many issues with basic soils around here. It's not totally impossible, but we don't see it very much. We mostly see really acidic soils. What happens when you're away from that neutral is that your soil nutrition becomes unavailable to the plant. In the soil, your pH of about 6 to 6.5 allows for optimum uptake of all of the macro and micronutrients that plants need for their growth and to sustain production. That means that your nitrogen, your phosphorus, your potassium, iron, calcium, molybdenum, magnesium, zinc, boron, there's a few others, are all at their peak of availability between 6 and 6.5. The lower you go, we have these bars that show what nutrients are available where, and you start getting really unbalanced as you go up or down. You start losing nutrients. So even if they're there in the soil, and even if your soil test said, yes, I have plenty of this nutrient, your plant isn't going to be able to take that up out of the soil. So it's essentially useless. Maintaining your pH is the biggest thing you can do to ensure your plant's ability to access the nutrition that it needs. You're going to find that out with a basic soil test. There's tons of send away labs. I'm not going to recommend one or over the other, because for something like that, it's usually like $10, $20 to mail it in and get back your results. There's going to be, most soil tests that you send in will have a form that you fill out, and you can say what you're growing. So I'm growing apple and pear trees, I'm growing brambles, growing blueberries, and it'll come back with recommendations for usually how many pounds per acre of fertilizer you want to apply. And in the case of low pH, how many pounds or tons per acre of lime. Now you can break that down to the size of the plot that you're working on. So if you have a 1/10 of an acre or less, you can still calculate that down because it's based on surface area of an acre. So not too complicated, and most soil labs will even help you break it down from there if you ask. Or your friendly local extension agent. I do a lot with helping folks figure out their nutrient management, but pH is really the biggest one. If you've never managed the pH on your soil and you're sitting in the 4s somewhere, usually the recommendation is somewhere around 2 tons per acre. You never really want to do more than that in a season because it's just not going to really do anything, and can actually cause other issues. And then after that, you can usually get by on a gentler maintenance. So once you do an initial application of lime, if you've never done it before, you're probably going to put a large amount down the first year, a minimal amount down the second year, and then probably about every other year going forward after that.
It's pH value
For uptake for nutrients,
for fruit trees.
it's still going to be right around 6, 6.5. And you know, there's some flexibility. If you're between 5 and 7, you're okay, especially if you're supplementing with fertilizers. But the more dialed in you get that, the healthier your trees are going to be overall, because they're not fighting to take up those nutrients with the soil chemistry. Pretty standard recommendation here. A 1/2 pound of balanced fertilizer mixed right in with the soil as you're planting for new trees should get you through your first season. And in general, your trees will need not quite a balance. You want to go a little less on the nitrogen, because you want it to put a little more effort into the flowering or the fruiting. Just some standard issue recommendations for the first 4 years. You want to give it a little bit of supplemental nutrition just to make sure. Apples, after 4 years, you really want to base that on what your soil tests are telling you. Apples are pretty resilient and adapted pretty well to our soils. So if you're managing your pH just a little bit and keeping it in that range, you shouldn't need to do a whole lot with your apples, unless your terminal shoot growth is less than 15 inches in a season. So if you're really seeing some stunted trees, then obviously they probably need some supplementation. But otherwise, after a few years, you'll probably be okay. Your peaches, cherries, and plums, they're heavier feeders. They're going to need some fertilizer every year, but nothing too extreme. When it comes to timing for established trees, you really want to think about, again, that phenology. Throughout the growing season, trees when they first come out of dormancy, they're using their stored reserves in the trunk and root system, and then they begin to uptake the nutrition, usually right around bloom or just after. Right around fruit set is when the tree switches from using its own reserves to starting to take up stuff from the soil. So usually from about bloom to maybe 4 weeks, 3-4 weeks afterwards is when you want to get that fertilizer on. If you put it on much earlier, you're running the risk of it just evaporating or breaking down and not really being of any benefit to the tree. If you put it on much later, you can, but it's going to be harder to get it on there when you have lots of grass and other things competing to take up that fertilizer as quickly as possible. So earlier in the season, but not really before bloom, is going to be your best bet for when you want to put that fertilizer on for the best effect. And again, testing your soil, you want to do it maybe in your first couple of years of production if you've never done it before. maybe do it once a year for 2 or 3 years, and then every 3 years or so after that, once you're comfortable with where your soil levels are and you know kind of what you're looking for, then you can go down to a less frequent testing. You want to test about the same time of year every time, and you want to try to test in general from the same location. You don't want to do it from this tree and then that tree way over there, because that microclimate thing, you know, happens with soil too, and you might see some pretty big differences. And yeah, and just kind of follow the advice that you're given with when you get those results back. The other thing that you can do in terms of figuring out your nutrition for your plants is if you're seeing issues that resemble some sort of nutrient deficiency, if your trees are stunted, if you're having yellowed margins or yellowing in general, if the tree's discolored, if there's like a purple blush to the leaves that really you can't attribute to a disease or pest damage, there is another type of testing, which is the plant nutrient testing. So that's where you collect some leaves and you send those in for sampling as well. Every type of plant or crop has a curve and a timing to compare that to. So if you had a specific question about doing the tissue sampling, I would check one of the Cornell websites for where you might send that in. And what that tells you is you usually take it at the same year as you would a soil sample, because just because there's nutrients in the soil doesn't necessarily mean the tree is able to take them up, and that'll tell you if it is. That can be because of things feeding on the roots. It can be because of poor irrigation. There's a lot of pH issues again. So figuring out if the tree is actually even taking up the nutrients or what it's deficient in can help you, figure out some of those issues or those concerns. Pruning. I'm going to hazard to guess that plenty of folks are here because they wanted to talk about pruning, because we're kind of right up to the last minute as far as that goes. Why do we prune? We prune to remove disease for sanitation purposes. We do it to manage the structure of the tree so we're not breaking branches. We do it to improve airflow, which reduces the likelihood of disease, and to get better spray coverage, which just improves our overall management strategies if we need to resort to those. There's a lot on this slide, so I'm just going to start kind of breaking it down a little bit. I focus pretty heavily on apples and pears for a lot of this, and we can talk a little bit about berries or other fruit, but generally, this during dormancy, which we've been pulling out of dormancy pretty early. So some of these ones that say March is fine, maybe starting to get a little bit outdated. You want to remove your dead or diseased wood, and you really want to pay attention to your tree structure. A couple of things to keep in mind. You really want to make those pruning cuts during full dormancy. If you do it too early or if you do it too late, if you're within 2 weeks of a sudden drop in temperature, so if it's I think a 30-degree drop to below freezing, when it's within 2 weeks of pruning, can actually make the tree really vulnerable to some winter damage, some cold damage. So that's something that you want to be aware of. You avoid that risk by doing it when the tree is fully dormant. So a lot of times we'll still see some green leaves hanging on well into November, depending on the tree and your environment. So you really want to make sure you're going for later December and going for probably, to be honest, like late February, early March at the latest. There are two main types of cuts, and they're going to be heading cuts and thinning cuts. If you're heading, you're cutting a branch off to shorten it, bring it in closer to the tree. If you're thinning, you're taking the branch off all the way to its base, to where it connects to the previous branch or the trunk of the tree. Heading cuts, because you're removing the tip of the growing branch, removes the hormone that regulates the plant's creation of new vegetative growth. So what happens when you do a heading cut, which are necessary from time to time, especially if you're doing something like, the renovation in this picture here, you are going to see in the following year a very vigorous new growth from the end of that headed cut. So you're going to have to make thinning cuts the next year. So generally you want to limit the number of heading cuts that you make so that you're not dealing with a whole bunch of nonsense next year. So, you know, if you have a few branches that are just getting out way too far, that are going to end up being a liability because of breakage, because they're putting out fruit too far out from the base of the tree, you know, make those heading cuts. But I would say keep it to just a few large branches per year, or keep it kind of minimum if you don't want to have to deal with a lot of that thinning the next year. As you can see here, this is for newly planted trees in their first few years of growth. So this is the current best practices in apple production, which is a central leader and a spindle type growth. So if anyone's seen trees that have been grown this way, you can actually end up keeping them quite small. So some of these practices carry over into folks that want to trellis apples and other fruit. So it isn't necessary, but you can see really well some of the way you can improve that structure and airflow with some of these practices. So what happens is if you make this, you always want a central lead on your apple tree, but you don't want it to be 30 feet up in the air, right? Apple trees can get really, really tall, and it becomes almost impossible to manage, to prune, to collect the fruit. You end up losing out on a lot of your tree when it's really, really tall. If you want that, that's perfectly fine. I mean, it's your tree. But in general, if you're talking about best management practices, you want to keep that a little bit more reasonable. So usually right around 30 inches is where you want to make that preliminary cut on a new tree. And then you're going to allow for a new lead branch to start to form. And you're going to manage that. You're going to have one central lead. So if you have new ones cropping up, you're going to prune those back. Those are your thinning cuts. And you want to reduce it down to just a few lateral branches so that you're not managing very, very dense growth for the lifetime of the tree. So this is an example of if you cut that leader too low, you can end up with a lot of strong lateral growth that can be really difficult to manage or get back under control. It can be very, very bushy, very close together. And if you cut that lead really high, you end up with a very tall tree and and a little bit weaker growth on the sides there. What this picture is showing is once you have that desired structure, this is the use of spindles to open up the tree. There's a lot of different ways people do these. Some people use metal or wood. I use basically pieces of scrap wood with a notch cut in each end, and you just wedge that into the tree so the branch is forced down. You don't want it, this one's exaggerated, this picture's exaggerated. You don't want them to be completely open, but you want it to be open enough that there's no compression of the bark happening, because that can cause weakening. There can be water collection, things like that over the lifetime of the tree that can really damage that. The other thing is, I know last time I had quite a few questions about renovation. So let's say your tree is already 30 years old and it looks kind of like this. I have a couple in my house. I'm going to take some before and after pictures, and I realized I forgot to take before pictures for some of the renovation that I'm doing. So I have a couple apple trees that are probably 25 feet tall, and you couldn't really see through them when the leaves were down the first couple of years. Anybody in that boat now doing some renovation?
Well, we inherited 3 very mature trees.
Mm-hmm.
They put out tons of apples,
Mm-hmm.
but they're a lot of them are defective, and they drop because there's just so many of them.
Yeah.
It's like these trees are beyond old.
No, that's well, generally no. So if you're going to do the question was, is there any hope for a very old tree that needs renovation? The first thing you're going to want to do is really assess the health of the tree itself. So yeah, it's not putting out great apples. That can be managed. For if there's a lot of hollows, then it's going to be very hard to really bring the tree back to maximum or healthy production.
You see how
if the trunk is hollow
Oh,
on
yeah,
the
one of them,
inside,
one of them.
if the branches themselves are very hollow, if you cut back and if you cut a branch, pick a branch maybe an inch or two in diameter and cut it, look for brown streaking or signs of disease on that inner wood. If you're seeing a lot of potential, if you're seeing flagging like you would for fire blight, and it's over more than maybe 30% of the tree, in some of those cases, it's probably just not worth your effort. You'd be better off replanting. Again, something to keep an eye on a tree that old that needs renovation is to see what diseases might be present, because any new plantings are likely going to have that same exposure unless you do manage to get it under control. That being said, if the tree itself seems pretty healthy, it's not riddled with disease, it just has some, seasonal issues with the apples, bitter rot, things like that. Yes, they can be renovated. Even trees 30 plus years old can be successfully renovated. It's about a 3-year process. So keeping in mind that those heading cuts are going to cause a bunch of new growth, you want to start out, in my opinion, with some of your thinning as much as you can first. So when I start a renovation, usually this whole inner circle right here, I take out everything but the main branches. So starting from the trunk, if you have any little spindly growth, any suckers that are coming up from the crotches of the main branches where they deviate from the main trunk of the tree, you want to clean all of that out. So I would say go at least 5 feet up each branch and make sure all of that's completely clean, no suckers at all. Do that thinning first, because that'll help you kind of get up there into the tree.
Yeah.
The next thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to watch for any majorly hanging branches, any damaged branches, broken limbs, things that could be a hazard or a liability. You want to take those out next. If it's dead, it's dead. It's not going to come back. So you want to take all of that out. After that, I would say in your first year, if you have some of these might require a heading cut. So if you do that, do those couple of cuts, thin out as much as you can, and then maybe see what you want to do from there. A lot of what you want to get rid of, see how this branch kind of crosses all the other branches? Those you generally want to get rid of because they're just going to rub and cause more issues. It's going to make the canopy too dense. See how this one kind of goes at a weird angle and crosses some of the other branches? You want to get rid of that. And you really want to kind of narrow it down to maybe 5 or 6 main large branches or less that you can manage and that you feel will be stable once the tree is bearing fruit. If you feel like it's leaning too far or if it's perpendicular to the ground, you probably want to get rid of it, because once there's downward pressure, you're going to end up losing that branch anyway. So doing it with clean cuts is best. You never want to add fertilizer during the renovation process, because you're just going to encourage that nitrogen, the water sprouts, the vegetative growth, which is not what you want to do, obviously. And you want to make this about a 3-year process. So in year 1, you're just kind of getting that structure of the tree. Year 2, you're going to do a lot of thinning and removal of a lot of those, the new growth, because once you do some of those heading cuts and the tree gets excited, it's going to throw out a ton of water spouts, which are generally just vegetative shoots that grow very fast and straight up. You want to get rid of those. A good practice, if you have the time to spend with your tree, is after you do those preliminary cuts, which are going to be, March-ish, up until July, the new vegetative sprouts that aren't going to bloom or bear fruit are going to snap right off. So if you happen to be strolling by your tree and you had a couple of big heading cuts and you start seeing those little sprouts taking off, just snap them right off. After July or so, they're going to be too woody, and then you're going to, if you crush the plant material or rip it, you don't want to do that, because that's, a place for disease to get into the tree. But while they're little and short, just snap them off, and that'll save you some some snips the following year. But in general, you want to make this like a 3-year process. So by year 3, you should have it pretty well thinned out. Year 2, you're going to be just doing a lot of thinning cuts. By year 3, you should be able to really see that structure of the tree, make a few final heading cuts, and then go into the following season with a good management strategy and a much more open tree to deal with. You should be able to start seeing improvement in year 2 after that first pruning. A lot of times you'll see some really good fruit. Keep in mind that most trees that aren't managed well will have mast years. So a mast year is a heavy crop production year. Most trees are kind of cyclic if they're left to their own devices, feral and out in the woods. You'll see a very high production year and then a low or no production year, and they will oscillate between those. Sometimes it's every 2 or 3 years. It depends on the cultivar, depends on the tree. A lot of our management, especially on the commercial scale, is to make those oscillations much less extreme. So we do things like carbohydrate thinning. We remove a lot of the fruit in order to make sure that the tree isn't using up too much of its reserves and then therefore goes back into a heavier production the next year. So rather than seeing tons of fruit, maybe no fruit, tons of fruit, we see lots of fruit, a little less fruit, lots of fruit, a little less fruit. So it ends up kind of averaging out over time. Anybody have any questions? I know I'm right about an hour. I have one more slide on pruning. Do we have any stone fruit folks here? You have some peaches? Okay. Okay. So,
I do have one question.
oh yeah, go
Sorry,
ahead.
sorry.
Yeah.
We have a couple we planted 3 years ago, a couple of pear trees.
Mhm.
And one of them looked like last year it was on its way out home, but now it looks like it's dead. The other one, unfortunately, was doing well, but this winter, a large branch off of our oak tree fell on top of it and broke. I mean, it literally broke right off like halfway in.
Mhm.
Do we try to save it or just start with
It's getting buds on
buds?
Yeah, I mean, as long as it was above the graft point, then you should essentially be fine, and it should actually recover pretty quickly.
I was thinking it could end up like that one on the left of eight.
And it could, and and I will preface a lot of this by saying this is the current commercial standard and what is recommended to most people for growing. This has changed in the past 100 years over and over and over again. So right now, this is what we think is the best based on the science and the research and the results that we've seen. That isn't to say that 20 years from now, somebody might say, we were all wrong and now we should prune the trees this way. So this is what's recommended, but you can also, with pear trees, you could do, if you start seeing this growth, you can do some heading cuts. You can cut back these branches. You can make sure you have that stronger leader, and you just might end up with a slightly bonsai tree. Fruit trees are pretty resilient, and you really can, I mean, you can't take a standard apple and prune it to a dwarf, but you could prune a semi to a dwarf, just if you're just keeping up on management practices. And I've seen people, even with standard, keep them pretty small, especially folks that have like U-pick situations and stuff. So, there used to be competitions at my college in pomology for folks that would do, how would you prune this tree? And there were people that were almost willing to go to blows over whether or not you should cut that branch right there or leave it. So it really, take all of it with a grain of salt and use your best judgment as well for what you're looking for from your tree. The upside with that is if the tree is budding out and looks healthy, it should recover fine, and it has a very strong root system to draw from too. So it should recover quickly. The thing that you want to watch is that if you get some of those like sucker growths, the water sprouts, that you maybe prune back quite a few of those, just so you're not ending up with really flimsy, floppy growth that'll never really be able to support the fruit that you want. You want that nice, strong growth. So I would keep an eye on it, and I would probably not give it any nitrogen until it rebounds a little bit, because you don't want to just take off with the vegetative growth and end up with weak branches.
I've got an apple tree, and don't even, but it has a bunch of shoots up the top, but it was like a well-maintained tree, I think, before.
If they're straight up in the air.
They are, is it too late?
No,
This year?
you're okay. You can prune those off. It's the reason we try not to do a lot of summer pruning, is because that sap leakage and the opening of the vascular system can create an inroad for some disease and stuff. That being said, I know some folks that recommend summer pruning in cherries, for instance, because they're so susceptible to that winter damage. If you prune too cold of temperatures. I know our pathologist at Penn State, she recommends only pruning cherries in the summer. So especially removing water sprouts like that, you're not probably really going to cause any major damage as far as it goes. And yeah, anything that's going straight up and is just, not really much on it and just a couple of leaves, yeah, those aren't going to do anything. I was going to put a picture of the difference between a flower cluster and a vegetative sprout, and then I completely forgot. But that's something to kind of start training your eyes to is, again, with your weekly scouting, look at which clusters become flowers and which clusters don't, because that's going to aid you in your pruning in the future.
Recommend maybe 15 foot.
I recommend some sort of trunk protection. So the painting them white works in cases, helps with borers.
White water.
Yeah, surround. So a lot of folks will use like the kaolin clay, which is really helpful. It can help with the borers that can be problematic. But there's other tapes and things like that you can use too, depending on what your situation is. If you have deer issues, if you have rabbit issues, you have what?
We have deer issues.
Yeah, I know. I've lost 2 cherry trees to buck rub, and my German Shepherd can't chase them fast enough.
I ain't getting rubbed off. It's getting pruned out.
Yeah,
The little ones that I'm trying to get started.
yeah. Deer are complicated. They do have solar powered water jet sprayers that I know some folks have had some success with just because it startles them, but it only works so many times before the deer is like, whatever, I'm wet now.
We put average spring.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So we eat the medicine too.
Yep. Stone fruit, and again, this kind of shows difference in trees. You can prune stone fruit pretty aggressively. Peach does best under heavy pruning, so you're always going to prune your stone fruit heavier. So you can see, I'm not sure how well you can see back there, but this is like a standard pruning. So this is what the tree looked like before on a 2-year-old peach tree. This is after your normal pruning. You're removing, so usually there's that 1/3, you don't want to remove more than 1/3 of the branches. Peaches, you can push that limit a little bit. You're going to be looking for that very open center, so you're not going to have that central lead like you will in an apple or a pear. Yep, like a champagne glass, thank you. Yep, so you want that cup, so you want strong lateral branches, and then you'll be heading them to make sure that they're not expanding out so far that they split the tree down the middle. So you can see this tree has been pretty well maintained. This is probably, I'd say at least 15-year-old peach tree here.
What causes the split bark at the base of the tree?
What's that?
I've got one peach tree that bark split down at the base of the tree, and it's going up the tree about like that. It's got a trunk probably about that big, going up about that far, but down the bottom it's about that wide.
Does it ooze at all?
No, I haven't seen it real using. It's all dry around
Okay.
there. And we painted that right up. But so far, it doesn't seem like it's gone down there.
Okay. So the question was, he has a peach tree that has a split in the bark down at the base of the tree, and was wondering what it could be or what you would do about it. Without seeing it, it's kind of hard to make a diagnosis because there's a few things that can cause it. The two concerning things that come to mind would be crown gall. which if it has like, if it's a dry lesion with almost like a cork-like texture, if you see some of the wood looks a little bit like, kind of like cork.
The wood just looks real hard.
Okay. And so if there's cork-like growth or swelling, then that can be crown gall, which is a bacteria that lives in the soil pretty much everywhere. Winter damage to the roots can cause the bacteria to come up, and it's basically like a tumor on the tree, which over enough years can restrict the vascular flow and cause decline. If you're not seeing that type of a lesion, if it's just a split, it could have just been some cold damage, or it could have been water inconsistencies. So it might have had some drought that it was dealing with, or it might have been waterlogged for a little while and it caused some split, and then it's since healed from that. The other thing that can start out like that, but is progressive, is fire blight or blossom blight. Can enter into the tree and then create lesions on the trunk and branches in the more advanced stages once it's moved in. But if you haven't seen any other evidence of fire blight or blossom blight, it probably wouldn't be that. But those types of lesions would be kind of oozing. There would be sap or detritus. It would be kind of a wet lesion on the tree. So
That's one of the best producing trees.
yeah, so I would say I would hazard to guess that it was probably something with water.
I've got one next to it that planted at the same time.
Mhm.
And it doesn't show any problems whatsoever. And it hasn't produced one peach. The other three are all producing peaches.
Is it the same variety?
It has, when I planted them, there was two majestic, two,
Interesting. Do you notice that they all bloom at the same time?
that one doesn't have very many blossoms. It gets a few, but not very many.
What kind of soil do you have? Like clay,
Down the bottom,
sand?
yeah, we have clay down there, but that's it's down the bottom. You get down about 2 foot, that's an old creek bed.
Okay.
And the other trees, like I said, the other trees are doing good. I put in 2 veterans last year, and they're taking right off the roof.
Okay. Have you done any checked your soil at all?
No, I'm going to.
Okay. That would be where I would start. And in that case, so how far apart are the trees?
10 to 12 feet.
Okay,
There's about 20 trees in the creek bed, 22.
is it pretty flat, consistent,
Yeah,
or
fairly flat. There's a slight slope.
okay? Where's the struggling tree located on the slope? Towards the bottom, towards the top?
Towards the top. It's not the farthest one.
Okay.
Towards the top.
So
And even with that tree, there's another place. I started out putting in 2 black cherry trees. The one cherry tree that got in there now, that's doing real good. That other spot, everything I planted dies. And it's one spot, it's one row into the orchard from the side and one row in from the top. And right now there's a pear tree in there and it ain't doing so good.
interesting. I would start with a soil sample, and I would take a sample. So when it comes to soil sampling, how you sample is really important. So quickly, we'll just scoot back to soil sampling really quick. So that was prefaced by there's an orchard on a slight slope, and a couple of the positions within the orchard are always struggling, and the rest of the trees are growing very successfully. So what I would recommend as a starting point would be to get the soil testing. So when you do a soil test, if you've never done one before, we usually recommend bulk sampling. So if you take soil from just one hole, you're not really getting a good view of what's going on in your whole area or in your whole orchard. So you want to take multiple samples and mix them together and send it as one like average or representative sample of what's going on at any given time. Now, that being said, if you have distinct differences in different parts of your orchard block. So if you have a high elevation and a low elevation, if you have an area that is struggling versus one that's not struggling, you want to take those bulk samples. You want to basically consider them two different orchards. So in your case, I would say the areas the area of that orchard that's struggling, I would take a few different samples, mix them together from the area that's problematic, and then from the area that's doing very well, because that helps you to capture more of the story of what's going on. You can compare and see, is there more organic matter here than here? Is there better nutrition? Is something lacking? And that can be kind of that first step in figuring out what's going on. Now, unfortunately, with fruit trees, if you have one spot that's a problem, I would really, the scouting we were talking about, I would really pay attention to see if there's some other extenuating circumstance there.
When I planted the pear tree, after 2 cherry trees had gone there.
Mhm.
So the next time I dug that all out,
Mhm.
took that dirt up back, and I bought a load of muckland black dirt that had been sifted, so there's no stone in it. Mixed a bunch of mulch in it, a little bit of compost, but not too much, and some sand. And that's what I put in the hole. That's what I planted the tree in. Started off pretty good.
And then it's still struggling.
It's almost like the roots got down to the old stuff.
And that would have been my guess. It's possible that you have a big rock under there that you just can't see. Maybe just even a couple of inches deeper, there could be a large rock or a pan layer. It might just be a wonky patch of soil. I mean, you can get mineral deposits in a certain area that aren't representative of, again, your whole area, but you just have one spot that's rough. Something else I've seen a few times is ants. Okay, yeah, because sometimes you can get ants that'll just decide they really like one spot, and they'll basically hollow out under the roots, so the roots are drying out and not able to get any nutrition. Yeah.
Baffles me. There's trees all around that. Too good.
Yeah.
That one spot.
Beyond that, I mean, if like don't sample the soil that's the good soil. Try to sample like right around it where it'd be like the bad soil.
I thought about planting a flagpole.
Yeah, might be. Sometimes you just don't get answers, unfortunately.
I'll try to check the soil thing.
Yeah, but it'd be interesting to see if there's any difference between the two locations. Something else can be nematodes. There are some soil dwelling organisms that can be problematic. There are some labs that'll test for them, but usually they'd be a little more widespread than one particular tree. But yeah, that's a good mystery. See, people never come to me with like basic questions about stuff like this. People come to me with questions like that all the time. So if you ever want to troubleshoot some stuff, I'm happy to participate. Okay, so I'm gonna pick back up where we left off. So just kind of going back to some of those basics of, making sure your trees are protected, that you're limiting the amount of damage that occurs in most cases. Things like, and I have mulch here in particular, but floor management can be a really big deal, especially in cases of heavy frost, water shortages. If we have a June like we did last year where it didn't rain for like 25 days, which can be problematic during fruit set. And competition for nutrients for younger plants, things like that. So things like mulching, cover cropping with something that's not as competitive with your trees, making sure you're keeping things mowed or using herbicide management if that's something that you're interested in doing, as well as mulching practices can help to reduce some of those issues that you might see from the competition. In some cases, having really heavy undergrowth under your tree can also create space for fungus to proliferate, for some pests to grow, and to get more access up into the tree. If you have brush or shrub or grasses that are this high, you're giving pests a ladder right up into the canopy of your tree, where you might be able to manage them better if they were closer to the ground and took longer to get up there to where your fruit is. one of the things I like to remind people with mulch, it doesn't matter really so much in the summer months, but there is a tendency for folks to want to volcano that mulch right up against your trunk. You don't want to do that. You can invite pathogen pressures. And when it comes to winter time, the tree actually needs those exposures to cool temperature right at the crown where the trunk meets the root system. They need those cold temperatures right in that location because that's partly what tells the tree to acclimate. That tells it to start to senesce the leaves, to start to slow the sap production, and to go into its dormant state. So if you have that mulch heaped up, then your tree may not acclimate fast enough, and it may be at more risk if we get an early frost for some sort of damage. Yep.
What types of mulch do you recommend?
The question is, what types of mulch do I recommend? Clean mulch, not dyed mulch. Generally, like composted bark is a pretty good one. Just anything that's kind of shredded and doesn't have a lot of other debris in it. So you want it to be pretty clean. You don't want to be introducing, Japanese knotweed or something into your orchard. You want to make sure it's coming from a pretty good source. Yeah, sorry if I bring up anybody's trauma around knotweed. But yeah, so you want it to come from a clean source. Composted bark is usually a good one. Something relatively local if you can, because, imported stuff with how many invasive species we deal with, there's always a risk if you're getting something from farther away when it involves forest products. You don't want some insect eggs or something in there, but generally just chipped bark and stuff is fine.
We keep a pile of mulch leaves and pine needles.
Mm-hmm.
Like them also with that.
Yeah, it should be fine. There's popularly in gardening world, not the world I really work in. There was a lot of stuff about pine needles being really acidic, and also using coffee grounds and things like that. To be honest, they're not, the amount that it would require is negligible. So you're not really going to have any issues if you have some on-site materials that help. You're not doing any real harm. And walnut. Don't use walnut. Walnut contains a compound which is allelopathic or toxic to other plants. Yes. That's a good question. I would ask your local nursery supplier. I'm pretty fond of Mike's over heading towards Lakewood. They're pretty knowledgeable there for general garden supply type stuff. In general, like I was saying, you might avoid some of the big box retailers because you don't really know where their stuff's coming from, and there can be some weird things added in. The one thing to watch out for with mulch too is if you're getting it from like a big box store, it's possible that there's been herbicide or other things in with that material. They wouldn't be required to list it if something was treated with it. If you have huge giant piles of mulch, sometimes large producers of those products will spray stuff with herbicides to stop plants from growing in their mulch piles and things like that. So there's a risk of that. You don't necessarily want to put that on the roots of your tree. I can't give you a for sure. I know exactly where to do that, but I would check with a reputable local nursery supplier. Yes.
Around our two pear trees, after we planted them, I put mulch leaves, but now after time, grass is growing and everything. Am I better off taking that grass out and just mulching? I mean, is it just because it's solid grass?
If the trees, so the question is it okay for grass to be growing around the roots of your fruit tree or up to the base of your tree, or would it be better to remove the grass and just apply mulch? I'm gonna say if you're keeping the grass managed, and the tree isn't showing any signs of issues, they are showing you're having issues. You might wanna get the grass pulled back, and then just keep the mulch on the root surface. If you're not, if the tree is healthy and thriving, if it's well established and you have the grass there, it's kind of neither here nor there. If you are having issues with competition, pulling it back. A lot of, commercial folks will do inline, in tree line herbicide applications to keep that clean and to reduce that competition and just have bare soil. I'm not a fan of bare soil if you can avoid it, if you can have a low growing cover crop. Something you might do so you're not constantly doing that work is plant something around the base that's low growing and nitrogen fixing. So it's at least more beneficial, like clover, something that's a little bit competitive. A low growing clover in that area might not be as problematic for you. But yeah. Any other questions before I go? Yeah.
Like with the trellising.
Mhm.
We planted a blackberry, thornless blackberry bush, and last year it grew like a weed. So we're trying to train it to grow parallel to the fence, but it's growing every which, and then the leaders get top of the ground and they take root.
Mhm.
Okay, so the ones, and that, we pulled up one today, and it's got roots on the end of it. What did you do with that?
Okay, so the question is thornless blackberries and trellis or management systems. So with most of your canes, you don't need to let the established canes go beyond maybe 3 years, 4 years at the most, before you can prune out some of those big unruly canes that are getting those really strong laterals. So I would say you're watching for those really big heavy canes and getting rid of them. So you're going to get your fruit on your second year growth, for the most part, second flush. So you do want to be constantly training and retraining new stems as it goes. So a lot of folks intentionally do that. They like air layering more or less, or dippers, like that's what they call it in grapes. So as they're growing, if you don't think of it as like we're going to keep them all nice and uniformly up, if you're going to kind of do them like an arc, that can be a little bit more manageable. And then you can prune a lot of those lateral branches too, if they've already fruited. So I never really see like neat trellis when it comes to brambles.
So, like if they're already like, the leaders have gone into the ground, because we did get them up on the trellis, and they're in the ground, rooted.
Mhm.
Do you leave those?
You can,
Rooted
or
in
you
the
can
ground?
cut it, or you can prune out the arc. If it's older wood, if it's like 3-year-old wood, that's
No, this is new.
okay.
We planted them last year.
Yeah, so you could probably leave that for a season, and then next year you'll just prune out those arcs. Brambles, once they really get going and are well established, you can prune pretty aggressively, and that's one where like the trellising and everything, it'll really help your airflow. You don't want a ton of those side branches coming off of those older canes, because it's going to create a really dense canopy, and you're going to have a really hard time seeing fungal diseases getting started on those interior of the trellis row. So you really want to watch for mildews, and spotted wing Drosophila has become a pretty big issue in our area. And those fruit flies, if you have a canopy that's real dense, you're not really going to be able to see until they are really getting established. So, yep. Trunk protection, we did talk about that a little bit. And trapping, so I talked about some of the insect stuff that you can do. Now there's a lot of different kinds of traps. This is considered an IPM, like a physical barrier, because if you're not using a bait or a lure, you just have a sticky trap, it's just removing insects from your area. Different types of insects like different colors or tend to be drawn to different colors. Usually if you just want to keep an eye on what's there, you can use these for monitoring, because they kind of indiscriminately catch insects that land on them. I would recommend having a yellow and a white trap both out, because those colors are attracted to different insects. If you think you're having a specific problem, if you've identified the insect, there are types of traps that have a pheromone that will draw in the insect and help remove them. The risk of a lure trap is that if your neighbor has a big issue with, you know, coddling moth and you put out the lure trap in your orchard, you might be bringing them in from a wider range depending on how close you are to other plantings. So, you know, there's different strategies for that, and most of the manufacturer websites or information on these types of traps have good recommendations on how to utilize them effectively. But again, just kind of removing insects or helping you to identify the insects by catching them all in one place where you might not actually see them. Using these supports. So sometimes with fruit trees, especially if you're doing renovations and haven't gotten all those heading cuts in, if you are setting a good crop on that second year, you might want to put in some support posts on some of those lower branches so that the weight of them isn't causing the entire branch to break if you plan on heading it later on. There's quite a bit of stuff you can do with trellising depending on what sort of crop you use or you're growing. You know, trunk protection, a lot of different reasons to have that. Even if you're weed eating around your base of your tree trunks, I've definitely seen some folks inadvertently girdle and kill their trees. You know, keeping in mind that if bark damage goes all the way around the entire tree, it will die. So be that because of rabbits or because of deer rubbing on the tree or because you've nicked it with the lawnmower too many times. Once that damage, honestly, if it's 75% of the way around the tree, you're probably going to lose that tree. There's not really much you can do about it at that point. And yeah, just minding your weed management. You know, in most cases, and again, I don't think you folks are a heavy herbicide using group, but you know that it is an option. There are quite a few herbicides that you can use safely around the base of the tree to reduce that, to reduce some of that ground cover if it's getting too out of control. Again, we talked a little bit about this. Pollinators are crucial to setting good fruit. So making sure that your management practices are interrupting their daily life as little as possible is always good. That's why we want to use, you know, good local mulch if we can. Something that can be helpful is if you have troubles with pollination and don't want to go get your own bee box to keep your own bees, you can plant some beneficial plants, some native plants. Honeybees, of course, aren't native, so it doesn't matter so much. But if you know a landscaping plant that you're fond of, that the bees tend to aggregate on, planting something like that, either on the edge or within your orchard, can be really helpful too, just to increase your pollination. Bring the pollinators in with something they really like, and then they're probably going to hit your fruit trees on the way out too. So always think about the whole environment and not just the trees when you're talking about having good balance as far as that goes. So yeah, if you have a flowering shrub that you really like that is always humming in the summer, plant one down in your orchard or along the perimeter to bring in some of those beneficials. Also, you know, when it comes to soil or when it comes to beneficials, it's not just the pollinators and the things flying around. We have beneficials in our soil too. So this is a beneficial nematode. There's a lot of stuff in the soil that wants to eat the roots off of our plants. And there are helpful critters that live in the soil that can help us do better. You can actually buy these and apply them as a drench and inoculate your soil with the nematodes. Something else that I didn't mention that I was going to mention when we were talking about planting earlier and nutrition is those new plantings. You might want to include a mycorrhiza inoculation with your trees. And that has actually been found in some cases to help struggling trees as well. So if you couldn't figure out what was going on with your soil, but noticed there were still some issues, that might be something worth a try. Mycorrhiza are a fungus that invades the roots of the plant and essentially taps the plant root into the entire mycelial network under the soil. So it stretches the roots reach throughout the expanse of where the fungus has established and is beneficial to both parties. It's an example of symbiosis. So applying some of those can be helpful. You can always boost your beneficials in your area and help to really balance out that ecosystem. I leave a slide in just because it's worth thinking about when you're talking about your chemical applications. Most of my apple growers in the area spray every 7 to 10 days from pre-bloom until about a week before harvest. There are a lot of diseases. There are a lot of pests that have really got a fondness for apples. That being said, we also have a pretty good environment for them. If you look in the forests around here, there's tons of naturalized apples that are doing just fine without any intervention at all. But if you are going to use some sort of chemical means or chemical supports, really paying attention to some of these things, and for homeowners, really those cultural methods, making sure that we're not harming our beneficials. Something that is important to keep in mind, there aren't a lot of chemicals available for homeowners that I would consider very effective. There are some. You want to make sure that you're rotating out the chemicals that you use. If you use the same chemical over and over and over and over, essentially the only insects that you're going to be left with, or the only fungus that you're going to be left with, is the one that can survive that particular chemistry. So it creates resistant populations, and that means that we lose one of the tools in our tool belt. So wherever possible, you want to look at your active ingredient on the label, and you want to make sure that you're rotating out the modes of action. Modes of action are how insecticide or a fungicide works. It's not just the active ingredient. So like pyrethroids, for instance, are a very common, relatively safe chemicals. It's a class of chemicals, and there's dozens of different active ingredients that fall into that category. So you want to make sure that you're utilizing a few different categories and not just switching your active ingredients. So that's something to keep in mind in your home environment. You don't want to just keep using the same thing over and over. You want to switch it out sometimes so you don't get that resistance. And making sure that when you are spraying, you're not getting any off-site applications. If we're using a little pump spray or something, that's not very much of a risk. But you also want to make sure you're getting your good coverage and following the label. Even with homeowner materials, the label is the law. Once we purchase a pesticide, we are legally bound to apply it in the way that it's stated on the label with no variation. So if it says you can put this much on and this much on and then follow it up within 10 days, I mean, you don't have to do the follow-up, but you probably should. It kind of, the example I usually use is it's like antibiotics. If you're treating something with antibiotics, do you stop after 3 days if it's a 10-day course of antibiotics because you feel better? No, you complete the course. So when you're reading your pesticide label, if it says to retreat at a certain amount of time, you should probably follow what the label indicates. And just keep your best practices as far as it goes. So that's what I have for my presentation. As I've been going through this, I've been thinking about other things that I wish I would have included. But in general, that's kind of, the overview of what a summer maintenance program looks like. And I know it's a lot, but really I just want to kind of recap or summarize the things that we went over, just if you need to write down a couple of points. Really, when we're talking about summer maintenance, the things that we want to become aware of is the phenology or the life cycle of our crop or our tree, the phenology or life cycle of the pest or pathogen that we're concerned about, and where throughout that season we can do things to support the tree in living its best life. So when do we apply our fertilizer for maximum uptake? When do we do our pruning so that it's the least harmful and most beneficial to the plant? When do we apply sprays if we don't have any other choice? And how do we keep record of that so that going forward, we have more confidence and more tools to help us make those decisions in a timely fashion so that we can stay below that threshold and actually deal with the problems before they're a real problem. I had a commercial grower who didn't know what pear scilla is. If anyone's ever grown a pear tree, there's one insect that's very, very, very problematic in pears. And it's pear scilla. It's this little tiny thing that looks almost like a teeny tiny cicada. And they'll decimate pear trees. And the funny thing about some of these issues is with pear scilla, the only time you can treat for it is around bloom time when it's in a little tiny nymphal stage that you can't even really see. But it doesn't become damaging until it's an adult much later in the summer. And when it's an adult, it has this hard exoskeleton and there's almost nothing you can do. There's no insecticides that will really kill it in its adult stage. So if you didn't know it existed and didn't know to treat, you're not going to know you had a problem until it's too late. And we see that with a lot of diseases in fruit trees and things like that. So kind of understanding what you're up against. If you do have a lot of loss or disease that comes up one year, it doesn't mean that you're out of luck for next year. It just means that you may have to start some of those strategies earlier. You want to do your identification this year while it's a problem so that next year you can time things with your phenology to prevent the problem in the first place. So that's where a lot of the learning comes in with all of this. And there is a pretty good curve. However, Cornell and Penn State both have some fantastic resources online and in print. Cornell has a tree fruit production guide that's probably about 150 pages. That's a pretty great thing that comes out every year. Penn State has a tree fruit production guide that's about 350 pages that comes out every couple of years in a new version. And that's like, the tome of all knowledge for commercial tree fruit production. So there's those types of resources that are geared more towards commercial folks, but still have a ton of information. The other place is if you just search Cornell home fruit grower, you'll find stuff that's geared more towards people that don't have larger acreage. So a lot of times what I've found when you're looking for information is knowing the right words and the right vocabulary, kind of coming back to that piece. So tree fruit management for homeowners, home orchard producers, things like that will get you much more targeted bulletins and information that's going to make more sense for where you're at in terms of your production levels. So we're right about 8 o'clock. Anybody have any questions? Follow-ups?
So how about face
Phone number?
info?
Will my laser reach?
Oh, there you go.
It was worth a shot. Yeah. So Faith is a grower that works with me. She's more on the commercial scale. Her family had Ray Hall U-Pick farms. So she's been in ag for, I don't know, what would you say, Faith? Your whole life? Diapers? So she's very, very knowledgeable and very helpful. They have kind of a diversified farming environment. So they have fruit trees intermingled with small fruit, bramble production. She even has some sweet almonds, which is amazing for our region. Yeah, so.
I'm sorry, Megan. I didn't hear you. What was that?
Oh, I was just telling folks what you do.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Yep.
With permaculture, there's 42 different varieties within our property, but I've worked in multiple specialty crops. So whatever you have, I can probably help you with. We hope.
Where's she from?
Northeast Pennsylvania, right at the state line. Yep. So, yeah. So she's a grower I work with on that level. Unfortunately, when I come out, I can give advice, but I can't actually take on the tasks, and she can do consulting work. So, okay. Anybody from chat or Zoom? Okay.
I don't think so. Thank you.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you, folks. Thanks for joining virtually. For those who couldn't be here in person, and thank you all for coming back. I will, do my best to bring more relevant programming for this crowd going forward. So.